Over 25 million people watched as Jasmine Crockett looked Pam Bondi straight in the eye and said what no one else in that courtroom dared to say. It wasn't just a debate, it was a confrontation about racial bias, judicial double standards, and the dangerous politicization of justice. Her words shook the entire nation and exposed a system that protects the powerful and punishes those who are never heard. So why did it take one woman's truth to bring it all crashing down? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The chamber was electric, thick with tension, expectation, and quiet calculation. Outside the Capitol, reporters packed the steps. Inside, marble columns loomed over the packed gallery like silent sentinels. Every major network had gone live. Headlines scrolled beneath the screen. Live, congressional hearing on the politicization of the U.S. justice system. Viewers from both ends of the political spectrum tuned in, hungry for fireworks, and they were about to get them. At the witness table sat two women who were never meant to agree. To the left, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett adjusted her papers with deliberate calm. Her navy suit was crisp, but it was her stillness that demanded attention, like a storm gathering behind glass. A former public defender turned legislator, Crockett was known for her firebrand speeches and her refusal to play by the script. She had walked into this chamber carrying more than statistics. She carried the weight of every wrongfully accused, every overlooked community, every courtroom where the scales of justice were tilted by race, money, or power. To the right sat Pam Bondi, radiating poise like it was perfume. Her reputation preceded her. Former Florida Attorney General, political pit bull, a familiar face to those who still watch the Trump impeachment reruns for sport. In her tailored ivory jacket and signature blowout, she looked like the embodiment of elite legal orthodoxy. Her expression was measured, her smile thin. She knew how to hold a camera's gaze and how to strike with precision when it counted. They didn't speak. Not yet. But in that long, loaded pause before the hearing officially opened, it was already clear. This wasn't going to be a policy discussion. It was going to be war. And just as the silence seemed to stretch too long, Bondi struck, not with volume, but with venom, her words sliding into the record like a dagger dressed in decorum. "Let's be absolutely clear," she began, her voice smooth and steady, but with a chill that cut through the air. "This hearing isn't about reform. It's about control. Who gets to bend the rules and who gets to pretend they're fixing them?" She didn't turn her head, didn't need to. Her eyes were already locked, unwavering, on Crockett. "We've reached a point where justice is no longer blind. It's selective, and it's being driven by a political agenda disguised as empathy." She lifted a folder from the desk, held it just high enough for the cameras to catch, and flipped it open like revealing a case file in court. "Let me give you one example. Travis County, Texas. A case involving a repeat violent offender, aggravated assault, history of domestic violence. The prosecution had the tools to put him away, but instead they offered a plea deal. Light sentence, no jail time." She let that sink in, slowly, cruelly. The district attorney behind that decision, someone this congresswoman publicly and repeatedly supported. Fundraisers, endorsements, public statements praising her courage to reimagine justice. Bondi's voice was measured, but her words hit with the precision of a sniper shot. "Let's reimagine that justice through the eyes of the victim, the woman who was attacked. Let's ask her if political courage matters more than consequences." She finally turned now, head tilted slightly, eyes narrowed with practiced judgment. "Congresswoman Crockett, how many more violent men have to walk free in the name of compassion before we call this what it is? Irresponsible, reckless, and yes, dangerous." She placed the folder down slowly, like a gavel of her own. "I understand where you come from, I do," she said with a patronizing softness that stung more than any raised voice. "But courtroom emotion doesn't equal courtroom justice. The law's not supposed to feel, it is supposed to work. And right now, under policies you celebrate, it's failing the very people it claims to protect." Bondi's voice dropped just slightly, like a final twist of the knife. "This isn't activism, It's abandonment. And when lawmakers defend bad prosecutors just because they share a hashtag or a headline, they are choosing politics over people, over victims. She leaned back in her chair, unbothered, self-satisfied. And for a moment, the room felt like it had tilted just slightly toward her. She adjusted her mic with one deliberate finger, as if the weight of Bondi's words hadn't even grazed her. Then she leaned in, not with aggression, but with the eerie stillness of someone who'd heard worse in rooms where no cameras ever rolled. Her voice came low and measured, but each word cracked through the air like slow thunder. "That's not emotion, Ms. Bondi," she said, her gaze locked and unshakable. "That's reality. That's the sound of what it looks like when the people I represent are drowning in a system designed to ignore them." She held the silence a second longer, letting it settle like smoke in a courtroom after a verdict. "You say justice is blind, but where I come from, it sees color, it sees class, and it sees campaign donations, especially the kind you used to cash." A murmur rippled through the gallery. Crockett didn't look away. "Where I come from, people don't get deals. They get discarded. And if you think standing up for those people is reckless, then maybe you've spent too much time protecting power and not enough time confronting it." She sat back slowly, but her presence filled the space like fire spreading in slow motion. "You talk about law like it's some sacred thing," she continued, still calm, still terrifyingly clear. "But the law isn't sacred if it only works for people who can afford it. If a rich man can buy silence, buy leniency, buy a clean record, but a black kid in Oak Cliff goes to jail for a joint, don't you dare call that justice." Her voice didn't rise, but her intensity doubled with every syllable. "The real danger isn't compassion, it's complacency. It's people in power pretending the system works just fine, because it works for them." And now her words weren't just directed at Bondi. They were aimed at every camera, every viewer, every person who had ever believed that fairness was automatic. "You want to know the truth? I didn't come here to make you comfortable. I came here to remind you that justice, real justice, isn't quiet, and it sure as hell isn't for sale." The weight of Crockett's words was still hanging in the air when she made her next move. Not with fury, but with surgical precision, cutting into the silence like a scalpel aimed straight at the heart of Bondi's record. "I think it's time we stop pretending that power always wears a badge or holds a gavel," Crockett said, her voice steady but charged with restrained fire. "Sometimes power wears a smile and signs checks in quiet rooms, behind closed doors with the blinds drawn." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. Her calm only made the words feel heavier, like the quiet part of a storm that flattens everything in its path. "And since we're here talking about justice, let's not leave your chapter out, Ms. Bondi." She turned slightly in her seat, enough for the cameras to catch her expression, composed but deadly serious. "Florida, 2013. A fraud investigation into Trump University lands on your desk. Thousands of everyday Americans, janitors, retirees, single parents, file complaints. They say they were promised financial freedom, mentorship, a future. What they got: empty seminar rooms and 3-ring binders full of recycled advice they could have Googled for free." She let that hang for a beat. No theatrics, just the weight of hard truth. "And right as your office considered legal action against that operation," she continued, her tone colder now, razor sharp, "a check arrives. Not just any check. A $25,000 donation from the Trump Foundation to your political committee. That's not rumor, that's public record." Her fingers tapped the desk once, quiet, deliberate. Then, like clockwork, the case disappears, dropped, buried, gone. The air in the room grew still again, like everyone had forgotten how to breathe. "And somehow you want to come in here and lecture me about ethical decay? About prosecutors being compromised by public pressure?" She leaned in now, but not for show. She was locking eyes with the very structure of hypocrisy. That wasn't justice. That wasn't discretion. That was convenience. Bought and paid for. Bondi's lips tightened, but no words came. Crockett didn't pause. She was in complete control. Slow, focused, relentless. "What did you say earlier? That the law shouldn't feel It should function, she asked, repeating Bondi's earlier line. Well, it functions just fine for Trump University. It protected them. It silenced victims. It kept the powerful untouched and the powerless unpaid. So when you stand there behind a podium or in front of a camera and pretend that this system doesn't bend to wealth and influence, you're not defending justice. You're defending the lie that you helped write. Now her voice softened, but somehow it struck harder. I've seen what happens to people who can't afford a lawyer, let alone a donation. They don't get their cases dropped. They get a lifetime record. They lose jobs. They lose custody. They lose hope. And while you were accepting checks, I was holding hands with mothers whose sons were locked up for less than a broken promise. Her hands were flat on the desk now, firm, unmoving. So let's not pretend this is a courtroom. This is a mirror. And the truth staring back at you, Ms. Bondi, isn't political. It's personal. It's about the kind of justice you chose to protect and the kind of people you chose to leave behind. No applause, no reaction, just the thunderous quiet of a room that knew something irreversible had just been said. But Bondi, cornered and visibly rattled, didn't retreat. Instead, she pivoted hard, seizing the moment to paint herself as the last line of defense against what she called a rising tide of lawlessness. Let's stop pretending, Bondi said, her voice louder now, her tone sharper, like she was cutting through a crowd rather than addressing a colleague. You don't want reform, you want disorder. She wasn't speaking to just Crockett anymore. She was performing, speaking to the audience, watching from home, to the political base that cheered every word like gospel. You've made a career out of defending a system that tells officers to stand down while streets burn. You support DAs who won't prosecute. You push policies that reward criminals with second chances and punish the people who wear a badge. She leaned forward, gripping the edges of the desk. You say justice, but what you mean is sympathy for people who break the law, and that makes you dangerous. Her voice dropped slightly, dramatic pause and all. Because when law and order crumbles, the only ones who suffer are the people who don't have the luxury to hide behind gated communities or armed security. She straightened her back. I believe in fairness, but I also believe in law. And you believe in feelings. The room went silent again, but this time the tension didn't crackle. It burned. Slowly, deliberately, Crockett sat up straighter, her eyes fixed on Bondi with the focus of someone who had waited her whole life for a moment like this. You want to talk about danger? She said, her voice low, her words like stones dropped into deep water, each one sending ripples. Danger is when a black teenager is pulled over for a busted taillight and ends up dead. Danger is when a mother calls the police during a mental health crisis and loses her son. Danger is when poor communities are policed like war zones, while wealthy neighborhoods get warning letters and second chances. She paused, not for effect, but to let the truth breathe. You say I stand against law enforcement. No, I stand against abuse. I stand against silence. I stand against a system that has been allowed to ignore the pain of people who look like me for generations. Then came the pivot, smooth, precise, devastating. You want to know what real lawlessness looks like? She continued, voice unwavering. It's when billionaires break laws with impunity because their lawyers play golf with judges. It's when corporations pollute black and brown neighborhoods and nobody ever gets charged. It's when politicians like you, who once held the power to prosecute, look the other way when the man writing checks to your campaign is the one being investigated. She leaned in now, her voice cold as winter steel. That's not law. That's privilege with a badge. And you want to talk to me about accountability? Her tone darkened, not with anger, but with lived experience. I've sat with mothers whose sons were sentenced to decades for stealing groceries. I've stood beside families begging for a fair trial while prosecutors joked in the hallway. Her hands were flat on the table, firm. So no, I won't apologize for demanding better. And I won't sit here while you try to blame broken communities for the cracks you helped carve into this system. Stillness again. Dense, heavy, undeniable. She looked Bondi in the eyes, not with rage, but with something far more dangerous to people like her. Truth without fear. You don't get to call me dangerous just because I don't smile while I watch injustice happen. You don't get to wrap silence in a uniform and call it safety. And you sure as hell don't get to lecture me on law when the law has been weaponized against people like me since before I was born." She sat back, still calm, still centered. "You call it justice. I call it selective survival." And this time, even the cameras didn't dare cut away. But the battle didn't end in that chamber. It only changed arenas, and this time, the battleground was the internet, where perception could crown a hero or bury a career in a matter of hours. Within 15 minutes of the hearing ending, a junior producer at the network clipped the moment and uploaded it to the show's official account. No context, no back and forth. Just one searing segment. Crockett, eyes locked, voice like steel, saying, "That's not law. That's privilege with a badge." The title was provocative. "Watch Rep. Crockett shuts down Pam Bondi in stunning exchange." And that was all it needed. The clip exploded across Twitter, then Instagram, then TikTok. In less than an hour, it hit 1 million views. But with the views came the divide. Instant, vicious, and relentless. On the far right, the attacks came fast and hard. Pundits labeled Crockett unprofessional, hyper-emotional, and a radical leftist masquerading as a lawmaker. Conservative influencers accused her of disrespecting law enforcement and turning Congress into a daytime talk show. Headlines from right-wing blogs screamed, "Crockett melts down on national TV." She was called a disgrace in a blazer, a walking identity politics campaign, and worse. They slowed the video, pausing on her hand gestures, her facial expressions, twisting them into GIFs and memes meant to belittle. One graphic, shared by a political action group, featured her image with the words, "Would you trust this woman with your safety?" Below it, 60,000 angry shares, 15,000 comments, most of them venomous. But on the left, it was a different storm entirely, one of fire and celebration. Progressive outlets praised her as a voice the system fears because it can't buy her. TikTok users layered her audio over footage of courtrooms, protests, and marches. Women of color, especially, gravitated to her tone, not just the content, but the composure. "This isn't rage," one post read. "This is resistance refined." Hashtags like Crockett Truth and "She Said It For Us" trended within hours. Educators clipped her quotes for classroom discussion. Political organizers used the moment to fundraise for criminal justice reform. People weren't just praising her. They were projecting onto her, drawing strength from her presence. Comments poured in. "You reminded me why I went to law school. You spoke for my brother who can't. That's how you bring facts to a fight." But it wasn't all uplifting. Crockett's team quietly turned off comments on several platforms. Not out of weakness, but because the backlash was starting to tip into threats. Her office line rang nonstop. Some messages were encouraging, others were chilling, a few were flat out dangerous. She had faced pushback before, but never like this. Not this fast, not this wide, not this personal. And still the clip kept circulating, frame by frame, sentence by sentence. It was dissected on cable news. It was debated on morning radio. It was transcribed, captioned, remixed, subtitled in 6 languages. Her face became a symbol of defiance, of division, of what it means to speak truth on live television and live through the fallout after. For every person who cheered her courage, there was another who called it a tantrum in heels. That was the price of clarity in a country addicted to noise. And yet she hadn't shouted. She hadn't cursed. She hadn't even interrupted. She had simply told the truth, and the internet decided that was enough to start a war. And just when it seemed the storm might pass, a voice from the old guard cut through the noise. One that didn't yell, didn't trend, but carried the gravity of someone who had once worn the robe of final judgment. The video was quiet, no dramatic music, no split screens, just a single camera centered on the face of retired federal judge Alan Kessler, a man who had presided over some of the most complex civil rights cases of the past 3 decades. He sat at a simple wooden desk, surrounded by shelves stacked with worn legal volumes, the soft glow of a desk lamp casting deep shadows across his hands. Hands that once signed orders that changed lives. His voice, when it came, was soft but deliberate, the way judges speak when they're not trying to impress, only to be understood. I've watched the full exchange between Representative Crockett and former Attorney General Bondi 3 times. He began, not looking at notes, but into the camera. And I want to say this plainly. This clip, this moment, isn't just political theater. It's a masterclass in what legal tension looks like in a divided nation. He paused, breathing slowly, almost like he was choosing every word as if it were going into court record. This should be required viewing in every first-year constitutional law class. Not because it was polite, not because it reached resolution, but because it exposed the exact fault line we've been ignoring for too long. The difference between what the law says and who it actually protects. He leaned slightly forward, his fingers touching in a steeple. What made it powerful wasn't the heat, it was the control. Crockett didn't shout, she didn't flinch, she didn't even interrupt. She told the truth clearly, calmly, and without apology. And what did she get in return? Smirks, accusations, a wave of backlash for daring to speak with the authority of someone who's lived what others only quote from footnotes. The video cut to a closer frame, uncomfortably intimate. Judge Kessler didn't blink. This moment matters, he said firmly, because it shows what happens when a black woman, fully qualified and unshaken, refuses to let the system talk over her. It shows how quickly strength is miscast as aggression and clarity is repackaged as emotion. I've sat in courtrooms where the same words spoken by a man in a Navy suit would be called brilliant advocacy. But when it comes from a woman who looks like Reppers Crockett, suddenly it's divisive. Suddenly it's a problem. He exhaled and rested both hands flat on the table. This is not a debate clip. This is a mirror, and the legal profession needs to look hard and long at what it reflects about us. His last words didn't rise in volume, but in weight. We teach law students how to argue, he said. We should also teach them how to listen. Because if you watched that hearing and came away thinking Crockett was the problem, then you're not ready for the courtroom. And you're certainly not ready to serve justice. Then without a sign-off, he leaned back and let the camera fade to black. By the end of the day, that 2-minute video was being shared not just on political feeds, but in law school forums, ethics newsletters, and faculty emails across the country. Not because it was loud, but because someone who had spent a lifetime in silence finally said what the system itself had been too afraid to admit. But as the public firestorm raged online, it began to ignite consequences in the real world. Ones measured not in likes or headlines, but in threats, cancellations, and the silent suffocation of pressure closing in from every direction. For Crockett, the wave of digital attention didn't end with applause. It came with menace. The first threats were vague, cowardly messages from untraceable accounts filled with slurs and veiled warnings. But within 48 hours, they escalated. Someone sent a voicemail describing the layout of her district office, what time the lights went off, how many exits there were. Another email included a photo of her standing in line at a grocery store 2 days earlier. One message simply read, "You made yourself a target." Her staff tried to stay calm, but the tone inside the office shifted overnight, from focused to guarded, from passionate to paranoid. Windows were covered, locks were changed, panic buttons were issued, and through it all, Crockett kept walking into the building like nothing had changed. But everything had. She now had armed security on rotation. Her personal calendar was scrubbed of public locations. Even her route to the Capitol was altered daily. She didn't cry, didn't complain, didn't pause. But inside, she understood what this really meant. The moment she chose to speak the truth on national television, someone else decided she no longer deserved to feel safe. And yet she still showed up. Across the aisle, both literally and politically, Pam Bondi faced a different storm. Her punishment wasn't loud, but it was precise. That weekend, she was scheduled to headline a major conservative leadership conference in Palm Beach, a speaking slot she had booked months in advance. Without warning, her name was removed from the program. Organizers didn't even call. Her assistant found out from a journalist. When she pressed for answers, the response was diplomatic but clear. "We've decided to take the program in a different direction." Behind closed doors, however, donors were furious. Some had already pulled funding. Others threatened to walk. They saw Bondi's televised performance not as strength, but as recklessness. "She let a personal grudge derail the party message," one strategist said anonymously. Another, blunter, She lost to a Democrat on camera. That's not what we pay for. Invitations disappeared. Her media requests were ghosted. The networks that once called weekly stopped returning calls. Her inbox, usually buzzing, went still. The silence was louder than the shouts Crockett faced. And here, under the weight of scrutiny, their differences became unmistakable. Bondi began to retreat, canceling interviews, skipping panels, refusing follow-up statements. She wasn't destroyed, but she was diminished. For the first time in years, she was no longer the face they wanted beside the podium. Crockett, on the other hand, kept rising. Bruised, maybe. Watched, absolutely, but rising. Her team didn't shrink. They closed ranks. They didn't cancel appearances. They adjusted routes. While Bondi disappeared into quiet damage control, Crockett stood in bulletproof glass hallways and answered questions with a fire that hadn't dimmed. Not because she wanted to prove anything, but because she understood that power is tested most when it's under threat, and she refused to blink first. In a week filled with headlines, outrage, and fear, 2 women were tested. Only one kept walking forward. But even in the heart of this chaos, Crockett never lost sight of why she spoke the way she did, because she'd already seen firsthand what silence costs in a courtroom built to swallow the innocent. His name was Darnell Whitaker, and he was already halfway forgotten by the system when Jasmine first read his case file. 34 years old, father, mechanic, never had so much as a parking ticket. But now he was facing 5 years in prison for second-degree assault. The police report said he had escalated a fight outside a downtown bar. No weapon, no prior. Just a name on a file and skin the courtroom wouldn't forget. The prosecutor never looked him in the eye. The judge barely concealed his impatience. The evidence? Weak. A single witness with blurry memory. No security footage had been submitted, but none of that seemed to matter. The gears of the machine had already turned. The arrest had been made. The charge had been filed. Now it was time to process the defendant. Quietly, quickly, permanently. Jasmine remembered sitting across from Darnell in that holding cell. His hands shook, not from fear, but from exhaustion. He had missed his daughter's birthday. His rent had lapsed. His employer stopped answering his calls. "I didn't touch that man," he whispered. "I swear to God I didn't." She believed him, not just because of the way he said it, but because of the way the system treated him, like he was already a ghost, like they had no expectation of him walking out. Just another case to close, another body to move through the pipeline. But Jasmine wasn't built for closing cases. She was built for cracking them open. She went back through every scrap of evidence the state had handed over. She noticed the timestamp on the body cam footage, missing 23 minutes. She filed a motion. They fought her. She pushed again. Eventually, they released an overlooked CD from a nearby deli security camera. Grainy, black and white, no sound. But there it was. Darnell, backing away from the argument, hands raised, never throwing a punch. The so-called victim? Clearly the aggressor. In the courtroom, when she played that footage, even the jury leaned forward. The prosecutor tried to pivot, tried to shift the timeline, but the image didn't lie. It said what Darnell couldn't afford to scream, "I didn't do this." When the verdict came, not guilty, Darnell didn't celebrate. He just sat there, shoulders slumped, hands in his lap, tears falling without motion. Jasmine didn't speak. She let the silence stretch. She watched him stand, step out from behind the defense table, and leave that courtroom with the kind of dignity no one in the system had ever offered him. No press, no apology, just freedom. That night back in her apartment, Jasmine stared at the photo of Darnell's daughter he'd given her. On the back he had scribbled in shaky pen, "Thank you for believing me." And that was the moment it hit her. Not just the weight of the case, but the shape of the system. The law had worked against him until someone forced it to see him. It wasn't a fluke, it was a pattern. And that courtroom hadn't failed. It had done exactly what it was designed to do, until someone made it stop. From that day on, Crockett knew she wasn't just arguing cases. She was pushing against something much heavier than a verdict. She was dragging the truth uphill through a system built to forget. And she vowed right then and there that she would never sit silently while the law erased people like Darnell again. While Crockett's resolve grew stronger under pressure, far from the cameras and the noise, Pam Bondi found herself confronting a different kind of silence. The kind that doesn't shout but slowly, methodically, starts to unravel you from the inside. The house was too quiet. The kind of quiet that doesn't calm, it accuses. Bondi sat in the same chair she always did, a white leather armchair in her study, a glass of untouched Chardonnay on the side table, and her laptop glowing against the shadows. She had watched the clip of the hearing twice already, then a third time in full, this time with the sound just a little lower, like somehow it would feel softer if it didn't echo so loudly through the room. She knew every line she delivered. She had practiced them, polished them. She'd worn confidence like a tailored suit. But now, watching it all back, the edges felt jagged. Her voice didn't sound strong. It sounded rehearsed. And when Jasmine Crockett responded, not with anger but with surgical calm, Pam felt a twinge in her stomach she hadn't expected. Not shame, not yet, but something that felt dangerously close. She paused the video and just stared at the frozen frame. Her own face, mid-sentence, caught between calculation and pride. She didn't like the way she looked, not because of her hair or her expression, but because she couldn't remember why she'd said what she said. Was it to prove a point, or was it to score one? The difference used to matter to her. Now she wasn't so sure. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard as she scrubbed back to the moment where Crockett said, "You didn't walk away from that case because of principle. You walked away with political capital." The line hit harder this time. It wasn't about Trump. It wasn't even about the university scandal. It was about something more insidious, the possibility that somewhere along the way, Pam Bondi had stopped serving justice and started serving herself. She leaned back in the chair, suddenly aware of how heavy the room felt. The walls that once held diplomas and framed press clippings now felt like mirrors. Every case she hadn't touched, every time she'd chosen silence over scrutiny, the political allies she'd protected, the moments she'd told herself, that's just how the game is played. She had played it well, rose fast, spoke sharp, made headlines, but now there were no cameras, no crowd, just her own voice, and a single question that kept circling in her mind like a low drone she couldn't shut off. Have I spent my entire career defending the law or defending power? She thought of the conference she was quietly dropped from, the calls that didn't come this week, the allies who hadn't replied, and yet what haunted her most wasn't being excluded. It was how easily they had replaced her. Her image had been built on control, precision, discipline. But now that image was cracked, and what lay beneath wasn't a villain or a victim, just a woman who couldn't quite remember when she stopped fighting for people and started fighting for position. She pressed play again, let the clip roll. This time she didn't pause it. She just watched and listened to Crockett's voice, to her own, and to the silence in between, because that silence said everything she hadn't been ready to hear. And after the media frenzy had cooled and the dust had barely settled, fate placed them under the same roof once more. This time not in a courtroom or hearing, but on a national stage where the audience expected fireworks and instead received something far more unsettling. The ballroom at the Hyatt in D.C. was packed beyond capacity. Rows of metal chairs filled the space wall to wall. Every seat was occupied, every standing space filled shoulder to shoulder. The room pulsed with anticipation, a quiet thrum that grew louder with every second the panel remained seated in silence. The air smelled faintly of coffee, polished wood, and nerves. Students clutched notebooks. Activists adjusted their phones on tripods. Behind the podium, a modest sign read, "National Summit on Judicial Reform, Equity, Accountability, Change." But no one was here for the tagline. They were here for the two women sitting on opposite ends of the stage, Pam Bondi and Jasmine Crockett, each separated by 3 nameplates and a gulf of ideology. Everyone remembered what had happened during the televised hearing weeks ago. Everyone knew this wasn't just a panel, it was a powder keg. And someone, everyone believed, was going to light the fuse. The moderator welcomed them politely, thanked them for their time, introduced each panelist with the formality of someone hoping to keep control. Bondi spoke first, measured, articulate, deliberate. Her words were all structure and no soul, the kind of legalese that fills time without drawing heat. She kept her eyes forward, avoided glancing in Crockett's direction, and spoke in terms of judicial integrity and respect for process. Her tone was steady, her posture perfect, but the room didn't lean in. When the mic passed to Crockett, you could feel the shift. It wasn't dramatic, it was visceral, a kind of collective breath hold, like the audience knew something important was about to happen, even if they didn't know what it was yet. She didn't shuffle her notes, didn't posture, just looked slowly across the room, then straight into the light, as if she wasn't speaking to the audience in front of her, but to something much larger outside the walls. She took the mic and said only one thing. "Justice has no color," she began, her voice low and unwavering, "but the people making decisions keep seeing only color and their own interests." That was it. 10 seconds, no flourish, no anger, just truth, placed quietly in the center of the room like a weight no one knew how to carry. And for a moment, it felt like time stopped. No clapping, no whispering, no pivot from the moderator. Just silence, raw and unbearable. The kind of silence that comes when a truth has been spoken that everyone recognizes, but no one wants to answer for. Someone in the back cleared their throat and immediately regretted it. A camera clicked. Bondi didn't move, didn't speak, but her eyes dropped. Not down in shame, but in calculation, like she was processing how many people had just heard something she couldn't refute. The moderator shifted uncomfortably, looking down at his cards, clearly unsure whether to speak or simply move on. But Crockett didn't fill the silence. She let it linger. She understood something that moment demanded, that power doesn't always come from what you say. It comes from knowing when to stop talking. Her words didn't need elaboration. They needed oxygen. They needed to be felt. And that's exactly what happened. The room felt smaller. The conversation felt bigger. People didn't just hear her, they absorbed her. Because deep down, everyone in that room knew what she had said was not an opinion. It was an observation. And no amount of policy language or political spin could bury it. She didn't lean back in triumph. She didn't smile. She just passed the mic quietly to the next speaker and folded her hands, unbothered, unapologetic, unmoved. Because sometimes the most powerful thing a woman can do on a stage built for confrontation is tell the truth and let everyone else sit in it. The echo of her words still lingered in the minds of everyone who had heard them. But behind closed doors, those words were doing something more dangerous. They were shifting power, and for the first time, the system was forced to reckon with her presence. The phone rang before the sun reached the windows. The screen flashed with an unfamiliar DC number, and for a split second, Jasmine Crockett thought it might be another threat, another reminder of what truth costs. But the voice on the line wasn't sharp or hostile. It was careful, measured. A staffer from the White House counsel's office, speaking with the kind of tone reserved for moments that rewrite things. "Congresswoman Crockett," he said, "you've been selected as one of 7 appointees to the new Federal Commission on Judicial Reform." She didn't answer right away, not because she didn't understand, but because she understood too well. Her mind flashed through 1,000 memories, nights spent poring over case files as a public defender, speaking into microphones that cut her off mid-sentence, walking into hearings where she was treated like a disruptor instead of a policymaker. And now they were asking her to join the table that decides how justice in America should evolve. She thanked him with a voice steady as stone, hung up, and sat in silence. Outside her window, DC moved like it always had. Sirens in the distance, the faint clatter of garbage trucks, the slow pulse of a city always watching, always measuring. But something had changed. She wasn't just reacting to injustice anymore. She was being asked to redesign the architecture of it, to walk into the belly of a system that had tried to erase her voice again and again, and leave her fingerprints on its walls. The same halls that once ignored her now had her name etched into policy briefings and internal memos, and she knew exactly what that meant. It wasn't flattery, it wasn't generosity, it was necessity. Her presence had become undeniable. But she also knew what came next wouldn't be ceremony. It would be friction. She would be entering rooms where compromise was currency, and her truth would make some of the most powerful people in the country uncomfortable. They'd call her aggressive, emotional, relentless, and they'd be right. Because Crockett hadn't come this far to be polite. She didn't claw her way into these halls so she could whisper. She came to be heard, and now they'd have to listen. And while Crockett was stepping deeper into the fire, invited to reshape the very system that once tried to silence her, Bondi was quietly backing away from the spotlight she had once commanded, without question. For almost a decade, Pam Bondi had lived in the glow of cameras. It wasn't just a job. It was rhythm, identity, muscle memory. She knew which side was her better angle. She could slip into a studio with a soundbite ready and deliver it with polished certainty. Her voice had been quoted in headlines. Her clips had gone viral. Her words, once delivered with clinical precision, had shaped talking points across the political right. But now everything felt off. The phones still rang, but fewer calls came from networks. More of them were from assistants and interns instead of senior producers. The tone had changed. Not hostile, just hesitant. And Bondi, for all her experience, could feel the shift like a tremor under the floorboards. She wasn't the headline anymore. She was the risk. It started small. She canceled a morning panel at a think tank in Miami, citing travel complications. Then came a Fox segment, once her turf, quietly decline. When a live stream roundtable on judicial integrity reached out, her office responded with a polite but firm, "Ms. Bondi is focusing on private matters at this time." In truth, she wasn't traveling. She wasn't sick. She wasn't out of reach. She was sitting in her house, curtains half drawn, television off, phone face down on the table. The same woman who once stepped onto sets with a grin and a folder full of prepared talking points was now avoiding mirrors and skipping press briefings entirely. She wasn't hiding. She was processing. The Crockett moment hadn't just gone viral. It had carved something open inside her. Not humiliation, not even guilt. Something quieter. Something she didn't have language for. She had always seen herself as a fighter for order, for strength, for tradition. But now she kept asking herself, whose order? Whose strength? The line she had once confidently drawn between justice and chaos was now blurred. And the more she watched the footage back, the more she saw not a debate, but a reckoning she hadn't been ready for. She didn't talk about it. Not to colleagues, not to friends. When they texted her, she gave one-word answers. When they asked if she was doing okay, she sent a thumbs-up emoji. She wasn't afraid of speaking again. She was afraid of being heard and people not believing her anymore. That was new and terrifying. Because once you've been a voice of a movement, losing the room isn't just silence, it's erasure. So she stayed off air, declined interviews, turned down op-ed requests. Some assumed she was regrouping, some said it was strategic retreat, but the truth was simpler and sadder. She didn't know what to say anymore that wouldn't sound rehearsed. She didn't trust her instincts. And without the certainty she'd built her entire public identity on, Bondi was left alone with a question more powerful than any headline. Was it all about the law, or had it always been about the stage? And in that silence, intentional, prolonged, and heavy, she still hadn't found the answer. And as Bondi faded from the spotlight and Crockett stepped fully into hers, the internet, restless, relentless, and watching everything, began to define what had just unfolded in language as sharp as the moment itself. The phrase didn't come from a news anchor or a campaign strategist. It came from a tweet, just 12 words, posted by a civil rights attorney in Atlanta. This wasn't a debate. It was the final battle between bias and truth. At first, it hovered beneath the noise. Then someone screenshotted it. Then someone turned it into a caption. Within hours, it was trending. Bias vs. truth started appearing under clips of the exchange. TikTokers overlaid the quote on slow-motion edits of Crockett's calm stare, her words echoing like a war drum beneath every frame. Justice has no color. Comment threads exploded. People weren't just commenting, they were confessing. "I've never felt seen by a politician until this," wrote a woman from Detroit. That moment was every black courtroom whisper, "We've never been allowed to speak out loud," said another. But it wasn't just applause, it was clarity. For years, people had watched politics like it was theater. This moment felt like testimony. There were no gimmicks, no yelling, just one woman stating a truth so raw, it stripped the room of its usual armor. Every frame of that video, the smirk on Bondi's face, the silence that followed Crockett's line, the shift in body language across the panel, was now being slowed down, dissected, and replayed not as drama, but as documentation. Influencers called it a masterclass in restraint. Legal scholars called it precedent in tone. Mothers called it the moment their daughters understood the power of composure. A retired judge called it a turning point. Some media outlets tried to spin it back, called Crockett calculated, performative, overhyped. But their words rang hollow in comparison to the footage. People had seen it. They'd heard the breath between Crockett's sentences, the pause before she dropped truth like iron into a room, expecting more noise than substance. And in that silence, they recognized something too rare in public life: the sound of someone telling the truth without asking for permission. It wasn't just a clash of two women, it was the collision of two systems, one built to maintain power through polish and performance, and the other forged in the fires of lived experience, pain, and absolute refusal to stay quiet. The internet didn't exaggerate when it named it the final battle between bias and truth. If anything, it said what institutions wouldn't. That moment wasn't about who won a debate, it was about who refused to be erased, and what happens when the world finally sees it. The video didn't vanish like most political moments do. It didn't rise, spike, and fade. It stuck. Not because it was explosive, but because it was true. It wasn't loud. It wasn't performative. It didn't come wrapped in clever sound bites or flashy edits. It came from a woman sitting at a table, speaking one sentence that punched a hole straight through the room, and the internet knew it had witnessed something different. By the third day, the clip had crossed 10 million views, but that number didn't tell the whole story. It wasn't just the views, it was the velocity, how fast it spread, how many people weren't just watching, but sharing it like gospel. Hashtags like "One on our BSV's Truth" and "Crockett Unfiltered" trended in different time zones. It started on Twitter, but within hours it was everywhere. Facebook Reels, TikTok loops, LinkedIn forums, even forwarded WhatsApp videos from uncles who didn't follow politics. And it wasn't being shared for outrage, it was being shared for recognition. People weren't just watching Jasmine Crockett speak. They were seeing themselves in her composure, her restraint, her refusal to flinch under the weight of condescension. She had stared directly into a legacy of institutional bias and answered not with anger, but with precision. And the silence that followed her line: "Justice has no color, but the people making decisions keep seeing only color, and their own interests," had become something sacred. It was more than a pause. It was an indictment, and the world heard it. Teachers began using it in civics lessons. Churches wove it into sermons. Debate coaches asked students not just what she said, but how she said it. Podcasts broke down her tone, her body language, the psychology of power and poise. Media experts called it a case study in presence. College professors called it a master class in controlled authority. But for the people watching from kitchen counters, prison bunks, front porches, and grocery store break rooms, it was something else entirely. It was proof. Proof that you didn't have to shout to be heard. Proof that truth, when delivered without apology, could still tear down the room. A retired judge from North Carolina posted a video to LinkedIn. He wasn't someone who normally made public statements, but he couldn't let it go. "What we saw wasn't politics," he said into the camera. "It was substance sharpened by survival." That line hit the algorithm like a match to gasoline. It was printed onto protest signs, quoted in speeches, whispered in poetry slams. One rapper from Detroit opened a track with Crockett's voice. A spoken word collective in Baltimore used the entire moment as the foundation for a performance called "The Room Didn't Move, But She Did." In Houston, a tattoo artist inked Crockett's line onto a woman's forearm. just beneath a stylized Lady Justice, blindfolded with dollar bills. In Oakland, a muralist painted her image across a courthouse wall, half in shadow, half in firelight, with the words, "You don't have to shout when the truth already echoes." What made it so powerful was how unrehearsed it felt. People were used to politicians aiming for viral. This was different. She hadn't tried to go viral. She had tried to tell the truth. And that's why it worked. You could feel it. She wasn't talking to cameras. She wasn't playing for points. She was responding to someone who tried to reduce her voice, her work, her history, to a stereotype. And instead of swinging back with fire, she let the weight of her reality land like stone. And while influencers dissected it and strategists tried to reframe it, Crockett said nothing. No follow-up post, no tweet, no victory lap. She didn't retweet the edits, didn't comment on the threads. She disappeared into the background like a ghost that had already said what it came to say. And in doing so, she made it all resonate more. Because it became clear, she hadn't said it for the moment. She had said it because it needed to be said. And the silence she left behind did the rest. Journalists began asking, was this a turning point? Not for a campaign, but for how truth cuts through political spin? Not everyone agreed. Some tried to diminish it, called it a cleverly timed performance, a media-savvy maneuver. But those claims rang hollow because anyone who watched it closely could tell. She hadn't prepared that line for applause. She had lived it, and that's what gave it weight. By the end of the month, they were calling it the Crockett effect. Op-ed writers described it as a rare moment where moral clarity beat political theater. Talk show hosts, even those usually cynical about DC drama, admitted there was something different about the way she held the room. It wasn't dominance, one commentator said. It was dignity, and it made everyone else look like they were pretending. Even her critics, those who disagreed with her policies, struggled to deny her presence. They tried. They threw words like emotional, aggressive, too polished, but none of it stuck because she hadn't shouted. She hadn't fumbled. She hadn't tried to steal the room. She had earned it. And the ripple continued. An elementary school in Newark had a 6th grade essay contest titled, "What Does Justice Mean to You?" Most of the kids started their papers by quoting Crockett. One student wrote, "Justice is supposed to be fair, but some people only see money and power." Jasmine Crockett reminded the world to stop pretending. It wasn't about party. It wasn't about left or right. It was about the feeling so many people had bottled up for years that truth had become too expensive to speak. And then someone did. And maybe what made it so unforgettable was this. Jasmine Crockett didn't try to make history. She tried to tell it. And in doing so, she became part of it. For everyone else, it was a moment. But for Jasmine Crockett, it was a memory and a responsibility. The world saw 10 seconds of clarity. They shared it, praised it, broke it into pieces. But Crockett had lived every moment that led to that sentence. She had heard that tone before. The dismissiveness in Bondi's voice, the insinuation dressed up as analysis. It wasn't new. It was familiar, too familiar. It had echoed in her law school classrooms, in courtrooms where she'd sat across from prosecutors who couldn't remember her name, but remembered her earrings. In interviews where the smile was praised, but the resume questioned. So when the cameras rolled and the microphone passed her way, she hadn't planned to make a speech. She had just reached the point where silence would have felt like surrender. And yet, after all that, she hadn't expected what came next. The messages didn't come from politicians. They came from people. Paper envelopes, faded stamps, handwritten letters, torn notebook pages, folded with care. Her staff hadn't seen anything like it. They'd received public support before, social media tags, articles, campaign donations. But this was different. It was quiet, personal, almost sacred. Letters from people who didn't know how to send emails, people who didn't have time to tweet, people who saw in her what they had always wanted to believe about themselves, that truth, even when spoken softly, could still shake the foundations. One letter came from a man serving a 22-year sentence for a crime he still claimed he didn't commit. He had watched the clip from prison, played on the shared television in the corner of the rec room. His note was written in pencil. No flourish, just raw urgency. When you said what you said, he wrote, the whole room went quiet. Even the guards watched. I haven't seen that happen in here in years. Another came from a high school student in Kentucky. She didn't use fancy words. She just wrote, I didn't know someone like you could talk like that and get away with it. Now I want to try. And with every new letter, Jasmine felt the weight grow, not as a burden, but as a reminder that her voice, once dismissed as too passionate or too sharp or too much, had now become something else. Permission. Permission for others to speak, to stand, to stop shrinking. She didn't respond to all the letters. There were too many, but she read them, every one. Late at night, with a mug of tea and the windows closed, some made her laugh, some broke her completely, some made her sit for long minutes, hands frozen above the pages, because the ache behind the words was too heavy to carry in one breath. These weren't political fan letters. They were confessions, testimonies, people saying, you reminded me I wasn't crazy for seeing the cracks in this system. She kept the most personal ones in a drawer in her office, not because she needed to revisit them, but because she couldn't let herself forget. The message beneath the moment wasn't about her. It never had been. It was about what happens when one person stands up, not to dominate, not to perform, but to tell the truth in a room that wasn't built to hear it. And something even more profound was happening now. People were no longer just quoting her. They were quoting themselves, empowered by what she had unlocked in them. In staff meetings, interns spoke with more confidence. In classrooms, students challenged outdated textbooks. On podcasts and panels, guests referenced her moment as a starting point, not the finish line. She hadn't closed a chapter. She had ripped the cover off the book and told people to start writing their own. But Crockett knew something most people didn't. She knew that telling the truth in public comes with a tax. Not the kind you pay with money, but with peace. Every time the clip played, someone else misquoted her, misframed her, called her lucky, called her dangerous, said she was calculating, said she was having a moment. She had to smile through interviews where the host complimented her tone, but refused to talk about her policy. She had to walk into rooms where people shook her hand while quietly planning to keep her out of the next meeting. She had lived long enough inside the system to know what happens when a black woman becomes too clear to ignore. But she didn't retreat, and she didn't explain herself. Because the real message, the one no viral clip could capture, was this. She had always been that clear. The country just finally stopped looking away. And as the noise began to fade and the world moved on, as it always does, what remained wasn't the applause, or the headlines, or even the viral clip. What remained was the lesson that crawled out of that silence, the cost of truth and the courage it demands. Justice, in theory, is supposed to be blind. But Jasmine Crockett had learned the truth the hard way. Justice in America doesn't wear a blindfold. It wears a mask. And beneath that mask, it sees everything. Color, gender, power, money, name. Intent doesn't matter when systems are built on habit. And too often, those habits reward the loudest voice, not the most honest one. What she faced on that panel was not just a political attack. It was a familiar ritual. The subtle undermining of legitimacy. The soft, smug dismissal that tells you, without raising its voice, that you do not belong here, that your anger is a weakness, that your clarity is a threat, and that your presence, your very presence, is the problem. But Crockett didn't break. She didn't roar. She didn't perform. She didn't try to outpace the insult with noise. She met it with weight, with memory, with the kind of truth that doesn't need a mic drop to be final. And that's what changed everything. Because people weren't moved by how she spoke. They were moved by what she didn't do. She didn't stoop. She didn't spin. She didn't deflect. She stood her ground calmly and let the silence between sentences do the damage. That silence became the weapon. And in a political landscape addicted to spectacle, that kind of restraint was revolutionary. So what's the lesson? That power doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers, and when it does, the people who benefit from chaos will panic. They will call your calm emotional, your truth divisive, and your courage dangerous. But they only do that because they recognize something ancient in your voice, unbought, unshaped, and unmoved. Jasmine didn't win because she outdebated Pam Bondi. She won because she didn't play the game at all. She rewrote the terms in real time, and people felt it in their bones, because many had been there before, in a classroom, a boardroom, a courtroom, told to make themselves smaller so others could feel bigger. And what does that mean for us? It means that silence is not the absence of power. It's the presence of control. It means that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is stay in your seat and let truth take up the space it's always been denied. It means we have to stop waiting for permission to speak like we belong and start speaking because we already do. The world doesn't change when someone yells. It changes when someone dares to speak without fear of being misunderstood. Crockett reminded us that you don't need the last word. You just need the right one. She showed us that grace under pressure is not weakness. It's defiance. That dignity is not passivity. It's power that refuses to shrink to fit inside someone else's expectations. She walked into a room that expected her to defend her place, and instead she questioned why the room was built that way to begin with. And in doing so, she didn't just speak for herself. She spoke for every voice that had ever been labeled too much just for daring to be enough. So if there's one truth to carry from this story, let it be this: that truth is not supposed to be comfortable. It's supposed to be clear. And those who benefit from confusion will always fear clarity. But clarity, spoken without apology, is a form of justice in itself. Crockett didn't raise her voice to change the room. She simply refused to lower her truth. And in a world that's constantly asking women like her to be quieter, gentler, more palatable, she chose instead to be undeniable. That is the lesson. That is the message. And no matter how loud the world becomes again, that kind of truth doesn't need volume to survive. It only needs someone brave enough to speak it, and someone strong enough to stand in the silence that follows. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.